History is a captivating subject, but some schools avoid teaching certain grim parts of our past. It makes sense, as these events can be really sad and hard to understand. Yet, it's crucial to learn about the past to create a better future. That's why we need to talk about some of the darkest historical facts that many schools choose not to teach. In this video, we'll explore 10 unsettling moments from history that are often overlooked in classrooms. The killing of vampires. Vampires have been a part of stories and books for a long time, but there was a time when people actually believed they were real. In the 16th century, folks in Europe thought vampires were a serious danger and started hunting them down. They believed that getting rid of vampires would stop the plague in their communities, which they thought was caused by the undead. To make sure vampires didn't come back to life, people would dig up graves they suspected and either burn or cut off the heads of the bodies. Some ways of killing vampires included putting garlic in their mouths, sticking a wooden stake through their hearts, or covering their bodies with salt or sand. These practices were later seen as just superstitions, but it's still kind of scary to think about how far people went to protect themselves back then. Combatants paused, so groundskeeper feed ducks. In the middle of the 1916 Irish uprising against British rule, something unusual happened during the chaos in Dublin's St. Stephen's Green Park. Picture this. The park turned into a battleground as the Irish Citizen Army took over, only to find themselves surrounded by British forces. A tense standoff unfolded, but there was a daily interruption. Why? Simply to let the park's caretaker feed his beloved ducks. Yes, you heard it right. The clash between the two sides took a break as they stopped fighting to make sure the ducks in the park didn't go hungry. It's a truly strange incident that made its mark in history. This person who discovered the history of watching for Soviet bombers. Back in the 1950s, the United States didn't have fancy technology to keep an eye on the sky for potential attacks from the Soviets. So, they came up with a rather unusual plan. It's pretty fascinating to learn that they had a program called Operation Skywatch. This operation involved around 1 million regular folks who volunteered to keep watch from rickety towers equipped with binoculars and a telephone. Their job? To scan the skies for any Soviet bombers that might be coming their way. It's impressive how the US could gather so many volunteers for this task. Here's the breakdown. About 800,000 volunteers were part of the Ground Observer Corps. At its peak, during the 1950s, these volunteers manned over 16,000 observation posts and 73 filter centers. Local civil defense authorities and the Air Force recruited these civilians, including women, children, and young men, to keep a lookout for any potential threats to their country. However, this program didn't last long. It was dissolved by the late 1950s. Alexander the Great had a very famous teacher. Imagine sitting in on a lesson from one of the greatest minds in history. It turns out that Aristotle, a brilliant ancient philosopher, was actually Alexander the Great's personal tutor. From Aristotle's teachings, Alexander developed a love for science, especially in the fields of medicine and botany. What's even more fascinating is that Alexander, during his conquests, brought along botanists and scientists to study the various lands he conquered. The story goes back to 343 BCE, when King Philip II of Macedon asked Aristotle to be the tutor for his son, Alexander. This continued for 7 years, until Alexander became the ruler in 336 BCE and embarked on his famous conquests. Alexander seemed to carry the lessons with him. He even took along a copy of Homer's works that Aristotle had annotated, a gift from his tutor during campaigns. It makes you wonder how this unique education influenced history and Alexander's leadership. Aristotle's teachings had a significant impact. For instance, he advised Alexander to be a leader to Greeks and a despot to barbarians, treating the former as friends and the latter as beasts. That's some serious influence on the world stage. The dead of Waterloo were sold as fertilizer. The Battle of Waterloo in 1815 marked the end of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, shaping European geopolitics for nearly a century. Nowadays, we're familiar with the idea of honoring those who died in wars through memorials and well-kept cemeteries. But in the past, things were different. Back then, when soldiers were killed in action, they were often stripped of everything valuable, including their bodies. In the case of Waterloo, something particularly macabre happened. The teeth of the deceased were pulled out to make dentures. This led to sets of dentures made from human teeth being called Waterloo dentures for many years. To add to the disturbing practices, the bones of those killed in battles like Austerlitz and Leipzig were shipped to Britain and ground into fertilizer. In 1822, a correspondent wrote in The Observer that the good farmers of Yorkshire are in a great measure indebted to the bones of their children for their daily bread. It's a chilling reminder of the grim realities of the past. Abraham Lincoln was a badass who kicked butts and took names in his youth. Abraham Lincoln, with his distinctive looks, tall and with a stovepipe hat, is easily one of America's most well-known presidents. We often remember him as the great emancipator, the leader who guided the United States through the Civil War and the author of the famous Gettysburg Address. But here's a lesser-known fact. In his youth, Lincoln was a strong and skilled wrestler, a part of local legend and tales from the frontier. One of his most famous wrestling matches happened when Lincoln, just in his early 20s, moved to Salem, Illinois. There he faced off against a local bully named Jack Armstrong. The fight went on for a while, and when Armstrong started playing dirty, Lincoln got furious. He grabbed Armstrong by the neck, extended his arms, and shook him like a rag doll before tossing him to the ground. Standing over his opponent, Lincoln boldly challenged Armstrong's friends, saying, "I'm the big buck of this lick. If any of you want to try it, come and wet your horns." Armstrong admitted he'd been fairly beaten, declaring Lincoln as the best fella that ever broke into this settlement. Surprisingly, the two not only shook hands but also became friends after that intense match. Britain's first satellite was wrecked by an American nuke. On April 26, 1962, Britain made a big leap in space exploration by launching its own satellite, Ariel 1, as part of the Ariel program. This achievement made Britain the third country, after the Soviet Union and the United States, to have its own satellite. It was a moment of national pride, showing that even though Britain had given up global leadership to the US and USSR, it was still a strong player. However, a few weeks later, something unexpected happened. The United States conducted a high-altitude nuclear test called Starfish Prime on July 9, 1962. They launched a rocket carrying a powerful warhead that exploded 250 miles above Earth, creating a massive electromagnetic pulse, EMP. This pulse was much stronger than anticipated and caused electric damage in Hawaii, nearly 1,000 miles away. It knocked out hundreds of streetlights, triggered burglar alarms, and messed up the telephone system. The explosion also created debris and a radiation belt that ended up destroying or damaging several satellites, including Britain's pride, Ariel 1. The Roman Republic's richest man died choking on gold. Marcus Licinius Crassus, who lived from 115 to 53 BC, was a big shot in the late Roman Republic and the richest person around. He supported politicians like Julius Caesar, funding Caesar's climb to power. Crassus joined forces with Caesar and Pompey, creating what's called the First Triumvirate, where they divided up control over Rome among themselves. However, Crassus was missing one crucial thing that his triumvir buddies had plenty of military success. He tried to fix that, but it turned into a disaster. In 53 BC, Crassus led an army of 50,000 soldiers to conquer Parthia. After a tough march through dry lands, they faced 9,000 Parthian horse archers and 1,000 heavily armed cavalry near Kari, in modern Turkey. Even though the Romans outnumbered the Parthians 5-1, they were demoralized from the tough journey and Crassus's not-so-great leadership. Sadly, the Romans were defeated, and Crassus got captured. In a cruel twist to mock his greed, the Parthians executed him by pouring molten gold down his throat. It was a tragic end for a man who had all the wealth but couldn't quite find military glory. Douglas MacArthur wanted to drop 50 nukes on China. In 1950, General Douglas MacArthur pulled off a successful move called the Incheon landings during the Korean War, turning the tide against the North Korean invasion. He then chased the retreating enemy up the Korean peninsula, but ignored warnings that China might step in if his forces got close to the Sino-Korean border. MacArthur thought the Chinese wouldn't do anything. He was wrong. As soon as MacArthur's forces neared the Chinese border, China attacked, surprising MacArthur's troops and pushing them back down the Korean peninsula. Feeling humiliated, MacArthur responded dramatically, suggesting the drop of up to 50 atomic bombs on China. His plan included nuking Chinese cities in Manchuria, military spots, and communication centers. The idea was to create a radioactive zone from the Yellow Sea to the Sea of Japan, sealing off the Korean peninsula from China. Luckily, President Truman disagreed with this extreme plan. He didn't buy MacArthur's assurance that the Soviets, China's ally, would do nothing if the US dropped so many nukes. When MacArthur continued to defy Truman, the president fired him. The creator of modern erotic fiction died from laughter. Pietro Aretino, born in 1492, was a multi-talented Italian writer known for satire, poetry, plays, and even blackmail. He's credited with creating modern erotic literature, which involves explicit sexual details meant to arouse. Erotic fiction has been a steady moneymaker for publishers for centuries, though it's often downplayed. Aretino's life was quite adventurous and shady, so it's somewhat fitting that his end came with a laugh at a dirty joke. On October 21, 1556, as a party was winding down, his sister shared a risque joke. Aretino found it so amusing that he laughed heartily, fell off his chair, and passed away right then and there. Different versions exist. One suggests he died from a fit of apoplectic laughter, while another claims suffocation from laughing too hard. Regardless, all agree that laughter was what led to his demise. Unfortunately, the joke that proved fatal hasn't survived for us to hear today. Thanks for watching the video, and if you found it informative, please like and subscribe to Time Capsule for similar content. We look forward to sharing more knowledge with you in the future. Until then, take care.